The Fire That Does Not Die, a love story for George and Anne. Part 1 of 2. Part 1. The Woman in the Rain. Or, How Madness Begins. It was raining in Florence when George first saw Anne. Not the romantic kind of rain from films, with delicate drops and colorful umbrellas. This was a real storm, violent and sudden, which had emptied every terrace in minutes and sent people scrambling into doorways and under centuries-old arcades. George had taken shelter under an arcade in front of a café with a half-extinguished cigarette and a cold espresso, watching Florence transform itself into Venice. He saw her running. She was running with a large canvas bag held above her head, completely uselessly, because she was already soaked through to the skin. Short red hair plastered against her face, a yellow rain jacket open, billowing behind her like a flag. Shoes entirely unsuitable for a storm or for running, heels striking the old stones with a rhythmic and determined sound. She stopped directly beside him, under the same arcade, and shook the bag with an expression of philosophical resignation. "Wonderful," she said in English, with an accent he could not immediately place. "Absolutely wonderful." "You could have checked the weather forecast," said George in the same language. She looked at him. Her eyes were green, a deep green like sea glass, and the expression in them sat exactly on the border between amusement and irritation. "Thank you for that. Enormously helpful right now." He smiled and offered her the cigarette. "I don't smoke," she said. "Neither do I, really. It happens sometimes when it rains." She looked at him for 1 second longer than necessary, evaluating. "George," he said, extending his hand. She shook it. Her hand was cold and wet and firm. "Anne." Outside, lightning split the sky above the Duomo, and the thunder followed immediately, close enough to shake the air. Anne did not flinch at all. He noticed that, and he liked it. Anne was a writer, not the kind who says so at parties to seem interesting, but the kind who actually writes, daily, with the discipline of a craftsman. She had come to Florence for a month, alone, with a half-finished manuscript and a need to complete it, far from all the familiar things that distracted her. George was a photographer. He worked for an architecture magazine in London and was in Florence for a week of shooting, after which he was meant to fly to Madrid, or at least that had been the plan. They stood under the arcade until the storm eased, talking. The café behind them was closed, but nobody came to move them along. Perhaps the owner was not there. Perhaps it did not matter. They talked easily, the way two strangers sometimes do when they know they will soon part, and this certainty sets them free. No filters, no strategies, no wondering what the other will think. At some point, without planning it, they went inside when the café reopened and ordered wine instead of coffee, because it was already evening without either of them noticing. At midnight, George suggested meeting the next day. Anne looked at him. "I need to write tomorrow," she said. "The morning is long." She was quiet for a moment. "Noon," she said. "Ponte Vecchio. If it rains, we shelter at the same café." He smiled. "And if it doesn't rain?" "Then it will be more complicated," she said, and left before he could answer. Part 2. The Italian Week, or When a Week Becomes a Lifetime. He did not go to Madrid. He rescheduled the flight once, then again, telling the magazine he still had material to shoot, which was true in the sense that Anne was the most interesting subject he had encountered in years, and he could not bring himself to leave her orbit. She knew he had rescheduled. She did not comment, but in her green eyes there was something that resembled happiness. Florence opened itself to them in layers, as it does for people who have patience, not as tourists, not with guides and pre-booked tickets, but organically, wandering, discovering. Small squares where old men played chess, restoration workshops that smelled of wax and aged wood, bookshops with Italian volumes that neither of them could read but both of them touched. They walked for hours, talked or fell silent, and both were equally comfortable. Anne wrote in the mornings without fail, with a discipline George admired, without fully understanding. She would appear at noon with slightly tired eyes and a particular energy, the energy of someone who has spent hours inside their own mind and is only now surfacing. She would sometimes tell him about what she was writing, not the plot, but the emotions behind the plot, the character who makes the wrong choice for the best possible reasons, the woman who loves too much and too soon and cannot find her way back, the man who confuses desire with love and only understands the difference when it is too late. George photographed Florence, but also her, without always telling her. A few frames caught when she was not looking at him, when she was reading or staring out a window or arguing with a shopkeeper in her broken and triumphant Italian. She found the photographs on his camera one evening and looked through them in silence. "You should ask my permission," she said. "Yes," he agreed. But if I had asked, I would not have caught this." He showed her one. Anne at a window, in the evening light, with a glass of wine forgotten in her hand, and her gaze somewhere far away, completely absent, completely present at the same time. She studied the photograph. "I look like I'm waiting for something," she said. "You are," said George quietly. She looked up at him. Something shifted between them, something that had been building for days, pressing against its own edges. She handed the camera back without another word, but that night, when they said goodbye outside her building, she held the goodbye, one breath, longer than usual. And George stood on the pavement after she had gone inside and looked up at the Florentine sky and thought, clearly and simply, that he was in serious trouble. The Fire That Does Not Die, a love story for George and Anne, Part 2 of 3. Part 3. Bella, or the Arrival of Fire. She arrived on a Thursday. George had not mentioned her to Anne, not because he was hiding anything, or so he told himself, but because there was nothing to hide. Bella was a colleague from the magazine, a fellow photographer, and she had been asked to join the project for the final days of the shoot. That was all. That was entirely all. Bella was the kind of woman who entered a room and rearranged it simply by being there. Dark hair, sharp features, a laugh that was too loud and too confident, and somehow exactly right for her. She and George had worked together for 3 years. They had also, briefly 2 years ago, been something more than colleagues, for a period of about 4 months that had ended amicably, and which George had almost entirely stopped thinking about. Almost. Bella arrived Thursday. By Friday morning she had met Anne. It happened at the café near Piazza della Repubblica, where George and Anne had developed the habit of having coffee before she went upstairs to write. He had not planned for Bella to be there. Bella had simply appeared, the way she tended to, with her camera bag and her easy confidence, and her history with George, written in the particular way she touched his arm when she spoke to him. Anne saw it immediately. George saw Anne see it. "You must be the writer," said Bella with a smile that was entirely genuine and somehow, at the same time, entirely territorial. "And you must be the colleague," said Anne with a smile that matched it perfectly. George sat between them and drank his coffee and felt, very distinctly, the ground shifting beneath him. The change in Anne was subtle. She would not have called it jealousy. She would have called it clarity. The sudden, sharp clarity of realizing how much you want something precisely at the moment it appears it might be taken away. She withdrew slightly, not coldly, not dramatically. She simply became more careful, more contained. She kept the exact right amount of distance, friendly and warm and completely unreachable. It drove George mad. He tried to explain Bella to her on Saturday afternoon, when Bella had gone to shoot at the Uffizi, and they were walking along the Arno alone. She and I were, briefly. Something, he said. 2 years ago. It ended well. There is nothing now. I didn't ask, said Anne. No, but you wanted to know. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the river. Doesn't matter, she said. Anne. She stopped walking, turned to look at him directly, with those sea-glass eyes that gave away nothing and everything simultaneously. What do you want me to say, George? I want you to say it matters. A long pause. A boat passed on the Arno below them. A group of tourists crossed the bridge behind them, noisy and oblivious. You rescheduled your flight twice, she said finally. For me, not for Florence. I know the difference. Yes. And she has been here 2 days, and you've already explained her to me, which means you understand exactly what is happening between us, which means you are not confused, which means you are simply waiting for me to catch up. He looked at her. Are you catching up? He asked. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she took a step toward him, closed the remaining distance between them, and kissed him there on the bridge above the Arno, in the pale winter sun, in front of passing strangers and indifferent pigeons and the whole ancient patient city of Florence. He kissed her back with both hands on her face, as if she might disappear, as if holding her still was the most important thing he had done in years. When they finally separated, she was slightly breathless, and her composure was admirably intact except for the very slight flush along her cheekbones. I was catching up, she said. Part 4. The night. Or, what a week of waiting feels like. There was no ambiguity after the bridge. They walked back to her building with their hands together, not saying much, not needing to. The city did the talking for them, as it had been doing all week, with its amber streetlights coming on in the early dusk, and its stones worn smooth by centuries of people who had also, at some point, walked this way, wanting the same things. At the door to her building, she turned to him. Come upstairs, she said. It wasn't a question. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor, up a narrow staircase that smelled of old wood and someone's cooking from below. Small rooms, high ceilings, a desk covered in papers and notes and coffee cups that showed clearly where the real work happened. Books everywhere, stacked in ways that suggested systems only she understood. She poured wine without asking if he wanted any. He did. They sat on her small sofa and talked for a while, easily, about small things, and this was the best part, George thought later, that they could still talk about small things, that the wanting did not erase the ease, that whatever this was, it was built on something real. At some point the talking stopped. He set down his glass. She set down hers. They looked at each other in the lamplight, and there was a moment, one suspended moment, where the whole week compressed itself into a single held breath. Then his hand was on her face again, and she leaned into it the same way she had on the bridge, eyes closing, as if his touch was something she had been waiting for, without knowing she was waiting. He kissed her slowly. She kissed him back without any of the restraint that had kept its distance for a week. What happened in that apartment on the 3rd floor, with the high ceilings and the writer's desk and the wine glasses left on the table, happened in the unhurried way of 2 people who have taken their time to arrive somewhere and are in no rush to leave. He learned her slowly. her quiet sounds, her warmth, the way she said his name when she was not thinking about it, unselfconsciously, as if his name had always belonged in her mouth. She was both more vulnerable and more present than he had imagined, and he had imagined, despite himself, more than once that week. She learned him the way she learned everything, with attention and without performance, no pretense between them, just the honest physics of two people who have wanted each other for 7 days and are finally allowed. Afterward, they lay in the darkness with the sounds of Florence outside and her head on his shoulder and his arm around her, and neither of them speaking for a long time. Then she said, to the ceiling, "She is still here until Tuesday." "I know," he said. "Does that bother you?" He considered the question honestly, which was the only way he knew to consider anything. "Not in the way you mean," he said. "Bella is the past. She knows it. I know it. And now you know it." Anne was quiet. "I don't get jealous," she said. "I know. I felt something, though. When she touched your arm, I saw." She turned her head to look at him. "I don't like feeling that," she said. "It means I'm in deeper than I planned." He looked back at her in the dim light. "How deep did you plan?" She almost smiled. "Considerably shallower than this." He pulled her closer. "I'm sorry to inconvenience you," he said. "You're not sorry at all." "No," he agreed. "I'm not." She laughed softly. He felt it more than heard it. Outside, a church bell counted the hour. Late. Later than either of them had registered. "What happens after Florence?" she asked, and her voice was careful in the way that means a person is trying not to sound as if the answer matters as much as it does. George thought about Madrid, about London, about a magazine that paid him to go places, and a life that had felt, until a week ago, entirely sufficient. "I think I follow the story," he said. "That's what photographers do." She turned to look at him again. "I'm not a story," she said. "No," he agreed. "You're the point of the story. That's different." Part 5, Tuesday, or The Things That End and the Things That Begin. Bella left on Tuesday as scheduled. She came to find George at the café that morning, alone, before Anne was downstairs, and she looked at him with the direct gaze of someone who has always preferred to see clearly. "She's very good," said Bella. "Yes," said George, "not your usual type." He smiled slightly. "No." Bella nodded as if something had been confirmed. "Good," she said simply. "You needed something that isn't your usual type." She kissed him on the cheek, picked up her camera bag, and walked to the waiting taxi without looking back. That was entirely Bella. He had always admired it. Anne appeared 10 minutes later, in her coat, looking at the empty space at the curb where the taxi had been. "She left," she said, "just now." Anne looked at him. Then she sat down across from him and picked up his coffee cup and drank from it without asking, which was new and which he liked very much. "What are you writing today?" he asked. "The part where the woman stops being afraid," she said. "Of what?" She looked up at him over the rim of the cup. "Of the thing she wants," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. She let him. Her fingers folded around his without hesitation. Outside, Florence went about its ancient business. The morning light fell across the piazza in long golden bars. Somewhere, a market was opening. Somewhere, a church bell rang. George thought about Madrid, about London, about a desk in an apartment above a narrow street. "I could stay another week," he said. Anne set down the cup. "You keep saying that and then staying longer than a week." "Yes. And at some point a week will turn into something else." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. That sea-glass gaze that had stopped him cold in a rainstorm and had not let him go since. I finished the manuscript in 3 weeks, she said carefully. I know. After that, I have no reason to be in Florence. No, he agreed. Silence. A pigeon landed on the table next to theirs, considered them briefly, and departed. I have an apartment in London, said George. I know. You've mentioned it. It has a second room, which currently has camera equipment in it, but it could have other things. Anne was quiet for so long that he began, carefully, to prepare himself. Then she said, I would need my own desk, he breathed. There's a window, he said, south-facing, good light all morning. She nodded slowly, as if reviewing a contract. And the camera equipment can go in the hall. Another pause. I snore sometimes, she said. Apparently, when I'm very tired. I've slept through construction sites. She almost smiled. Almost. This is a terrible idea, she said. Probably, he agreed. The kind that makes no logical sense, none whatsoever. The kind that you do anyway, because the alternative is worse. Yes, said George. Exactly that. She looked at him across the coffee cups and the morning light and the weeks of talking, and the bridges and the wine and the photograph of a woman at a window waiting for something she had not yet named. All right, she said quietly. All right. He brought her hand to his mouth and held it there for a moment. She did not pull away. Florence continued around them, indifferent and eternal, having seen all of this before and finding it no less worth watching for that. Epilogue, the south-facing window, or everything after. The second room in George's London apartment had good light all morning. Anne's desk sat in front of the south-facing window he had promised, and on it were her notebooks and her coffee cups and the particular organized chaos of someone who thinks for a living. The camera equipment had gone in the hall, where it took up more space than he remembered but less space than it mattered. She wrote in the mornings, he shot in the afternoons. In the evenings they cooked, or did not cook, or ordered food and ate it on the sofa and talked about the things they had seen and the things they were making, and sometimes about nothing at all. He photographed her sometimes, still without always asking. She still said he should. He still showed her the results, and she still could not argue with them, because he saw her the way she could not quite see herself, open, unguarded, entirely there. The manuscript was finished on a gray March morning. She came out of the second room and stood in the doorway of the kitchen where he was making coffee and said simply, It's done. He turned around. Her eyes were bright in a way that was close to tears, the way they get when something you have carried for a long time is finally set down. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and they stayed like that for a while, in the gray morning light, with the coffee forgotten, and the city outside, and the manuscript done, and everything else still ahead of them, wide open, without an ending yet, which is the best kind of story, which is the only kind that matters. The end. If this story found you at the right moment, if it gave you something warm to carry into your evening, share it with someone who needs the same. And if you want more nights like this one, more beginnings, more stories, more of whatever this was, subscribe to Midnight Confessions. We'll always have another story waiting for you in the dark just like this one.